Welcome back. I am continuing to work on the Grand Prix attack, which is one of White's ways of responding to the Sicilian defense. I've already gotten to play it, 5 or 10 times, mostly in bullet and blitz games, and I usually see the same handful of responses. But I'm just going to show you what I figured out so far and why I think I'm going to like this opening. One thing I really like about it is that at least up until 3 or 4 moves, I don't need a lot of memorization, and in fact, almost no matter what black plays, I can play the same next move. Now, what we saw in my last video was that after black plays c5, which is the Sicilian defense, instead of immediately playing the Grand Prix attack, which is f4, I would first play knight to c3. One thing that knight to c3 does is it prevents the d3 from happening immediately because I now have 2 pieces guarding that square. The second thing that it does is it looks like an exact normal response to the Sicilian defense, which the opponent has seen very often if they've played the Sicilian defense a lot. And they're probably not prepared for f4 to be the third move. So what I did, I looked at all the things that black would play now on move 2 after I have played knight to c3 and haven't yet played f4. And according to the players database on Lichess, almost half the time black's next move is going to be knight to c6. It's about 43% of all games. And then I can play f4. And what I did was I looked at all the other possibilities. Well, not all of them. I looked at the 6 most popular ones, which comprise about 97%, according to the little list I have here, of all responses. After this point, that's 43%, d6 is 26%, e6 is 17%, and g6 is 5%. Those are the 4 most common. The other 2, which I have already seen and which make up the rest of the 97%, are a6 and e5, believe it or not. And what I did was I looked at each one of those, I moved each one of those pieces and then saw how bad it would be or how good it would be for me to play f4, which is my next move. And in all of those cases, if black plays this, I can play f4. If black plays d6, I can play f4. If black plays e6, I can play f4. If black plays, what did I say, e5, I'm not in order, I know that, but I can play f4 here. And you can see what Stockfish has done there. The evaluation is still even, and in a couple of the positions, just very slightly less than even, but very close to even. And what did I say? The other ones were g6. If black plays g6, I can play f4. And it's still, as you can see, very close to even. If black plays a6, I can play f4. And that's one of the things that I'm pretty sure I'm going to like about this opening. Whenever I see the Sicilian defense played against my e4, I can throw the knight to c3, and then I know pretty much anything that black does at this point, I can play f4 as my next move. And then the even better thing for me, because at my age I don't have the sharpest memory, I remember a whole ton of things that I've accumulated in my brain throughout the 50-something years of my life. But adding new stuff in there is difficult without a ton of repetition. And what's going to make this relatively easy for me is that no matter what they play, and I play f4, and then almost no matter what they play next after that, I can play knight to f3, putting the knight behind that pawn, and then being only 1 step away from castling. Now, I did come up with a few exceptions, and I'm just going to run over those. Okay, and just to show you, if they play this and I play f4, almost no matter what they play here, knight to f3 is my 4th move. And even though that is a little bit of memorization, it's A, a natural move, and B, it's going to be the same almost no matter what they play. And like I said, I came up with a few exceptions, and I'm just going to go over those to help cement them in my head. So if knight to c6 is their 2nd move, and I play f4, there are quite a few possible 3rd moves for black. The most common one here is e6, according to the players database. And if they play e6, I can play knight to f3. Backing up, the next most common is d6. And if they play d6, I can play knight to f3. Another common move here is g6, which could have been their 2nd move, but in this case it's their 3rd move. I can play knight to f3. And as you can see from the engine here, we're still very close to even. After g6, e5 is the next most common, and this is one of the exceptions. If you can read the suggested lines up there in the upper right, here my best move is to take that pawn, and that gives me about a +1 advantage. And it's not their best move to take back. It's not listed as one of the top 3, but I bet if we go to the book moves, it is the by far most common for them to take that pawn. If they take that pawn, I can play d4 immediately, which they will probably take, and it is their best move, but then I take with the queen. And I'm up +1.5. So just to back up, this is one of the exceptions here if they play e5 as their 3rd move. In this case, I do not play knight to a3. I take the pawn. Sorry, I said a3. I meant knight to f3. I don't play knight to f3 in this case because it's an immediate threat, and I can take one of their center pawns with this pawn. And like I said, almost everybody here in the players database takes the pawn, But the second most common move is the one that I'm worried about, so I want to look at it, and that's queen to h4 check. But I think in that case, I can just block with the g-pawn. And it says that I can, and then their best move is to put the queen all the way back. But the most common move is queen to e7, not going all the way back, putting an extra defender or an extra attacker on my front e-pawn. The second most common is g5, and the third most common is going all the way back. Okay, so that's what I wanted to look at, but in most cases, what I'm going to see here is the knight taking that front pawn, and then I will play d4, and they'll take it, and I'll take with my queen, and the knight will probably just go back, and then I'll drop my queen back one. Okay, backing up again. Okay, now, after e5, what is the next most common? It's a6. If they play a6, I can play knight to f3. The next most common third move by black is knight to f6, and this is another exception to the knight to f3 rule. In this case, it's my best move to play e5. So I would just push this pawn to immediately threaten that knight, which is almost always a good idea when they have two knights here, but neither one of their E or D pawns have moved. And in this case, it's their best move and the most common to just put the knight back. And then once they've done that, I can play knight to f3. Okay, so that's the second exception. So far, the two exceptions we've got are e5 and knight to f6. In either one of those, I don't play knight to f3. I play something else. If they play the pawn, I take it. If they play the knight, I push my e-pawn to threaten the knight. The next most common third move by black is b6. And if they play b6, I can play knight to f3. And the last one that I checked, the eighth third move after knight to c6, is d5. That's another exception. If they play d5, I can take the pawn instead of playing knight to f3, but not with my pawn. It's better to take with the knight. And I think that makes sense because I don't want to get this pawn off its file just yet, so I would take this with the knight. And even though Stockfish says that here their best moves are f5, e5, or knight to f6, the most common move that we see here is e6, which directly threatens my knight. And when they play e6, I'll just put this knight back where it was. And that is by far the most common move by white here, but just as good, according to Stockfish, is putting the knight here on e3, which is what I'm going to try to do because it gets out of the way of this pawn. Because here in a little bit, I am going to want to start pushing some of these pawns. Depends on what my opponent does, but if I put the knight back on c3, then I've moved that knight 3 times, and it's back where it was in front of the c-pawn. But if I put it back here, not only does it continue to protect 2 of these center adjacent squares, but it gets out of the way of this pawn, and it provides an extra layer of protection for my king. And of course, pretty soon I will get the other knight out to f3, and those 2 knights will be side by side, guarding a bunch of squares across there. In fact, all of these from there. So anyway, d5 was the last exception, and we've exhausted almost all of the third moves by black here. So just to recap again for myself, but if you're trying to learn the Grand Prix opening or looking at it, after we play f4 on our third move, depending on what black does, we're going to play knight to f3, except in 3 exceptions. And those exceptions were e5, in which we take the pawn, knight to f6, in which case we push the e-pawn, and d5, in which case we take it with the knight. I think I can remember those 3 exceptions to the knight to f3 rule because each one of them makes sense. One is they've just given me the e-pawn for the taking. 2 is they've put the knight where I can immediately threaten it with the pawn. And 3 is I can just pick off a center pawn basically for free and then end up with that knight here on e3 in front of my king and out of the way of the c-pawn. Okay, but what if they don't play knight to c6 as their second move? I only came up with 1 exception to the knight to f3 rule if they didn't play knight to c6. So let's back up to before they played knight to c6, and here on black's second move, as we said, the second most common second move is d6. In that case, I will play f4, and then almost no matter what they do, I will play knight to f3. I didn't come up with any significant exceptions in this case. In fact, if they play d6 and I play f4, the most common next move is knight to c6, in which case we've just transposed to one of the positions that if they had played knight to c6 first and then d6, I'm still going to play knight to f3. Other moves here are knight to f6, e6, g6. In any of those cases, I'll play knight to f3. So backing up, instead of d6, what's their next most common second move was e6. And again, I'll play f4, and then almost no matter what they do, I couldn't find any significant exceptions. I will play knight to f3. I suppose one possible exception would be d5. Does anybody play d5? A few people do, and it is the top move. Why did I not check that as the next most common? Oh, I did check it. You know what? If they play d5, that's not even an exception. I can still play knight to f3. I can check with the bishop. But that runs into some complications and where I have to remember a lot of stuff. But as you can see from Stockfish's suggested moves, knight to f3 works just fine here. If they take here, which isn't the most common next move, but Stockfish says it's the best. I'll just take it with this knight and I'm okay. We're dead even. So backing up once again, if g6 is the first move, I'm going to play f4, and almost everybody who plays g6 here will play bishop to g7 next, according to the player's database, or knight to c6. Now, if they play the bishop to g7, it's not necessarily my best move, but it's just fine to play the knight to f3. So again, I don't have to remember what my fourth move is because it just works. Some people do not put the bishop up there. The next most common move here is this, which I don't know why you would play the knight to c6 if you moved the g-pawn already. But in this case, I can just play knight to f3, and I'm just shy of zeros on the evaluation. And then they're going to play here, and then I can just play d3, and we're good to go. The next most common second move by black is a6, in which case I play f4, and then almost no matter what they do, I'm going to play knight to f3. I didn't find any significant exceptions to that rule. Again, unless they do something obvious like d5, in which I would just take it, but d5 is not a common third move here by black. So I can just remember knight to f3 as my fourth move. Now, if they play e5 as their second move, I can still play f4 here, and I did find one exception under this. If they take, I'm still going to play knight to f3. If they defend that pawn by playing d6, I'm still going to play knight to f3. The exception here is if they play knight to c6 now, instead of playing knight to f3, I take this pawn. And when I take the pawn, Stockfish says it's by far their best move to just put this knight back here on e7, but almost everybody at my level takes this pawn, and then I can play d4, and we've transposed into a position that we saw earlier, where they played knight to c6 first and then e5. And the outcome here is the same. They're going to take this pawn, I'm going to take with the queen, they're probably going to put their knight back on c6, and then I will drop the queen back one. And once again, I was doing this for me just to run through these moves in my head and try to cement them, but I do think I'm going to like this, opening this modified Grand Prix attack where I play the knight to c3 first, backing up, because this looks just like a closed Sicilian defense, which the opponent has seen hundreds of times, however long they've been playing the Sicilian. And so when I lose these games, it's not going to be because of the opening, because I'm just going to remember that no matter what they play next, I'm going to play f4, with the lone exception, which is almost never played, but does show up a little bit in the database, of d5 here. And if they play d5, I can take with either the knight or the pawn, and I'll be fine. But again, I'm probably not going to see that. But anything else, I'm going to play f4 here, and then almost anything else on their next move, I'm going to play knight to f3, with the 4 exceptions that I just went over. And hopefully I'll remember those because they seem fairly easy to remember. So good luck to me going forward with this. I have been seeing the Sicilian defense a little bit more recently than I had for the last year and a half. It seemed like I used to see it very rarely, which is probably a good idea at my level. All the titled players say people at my level should not play the Sicilian, but some people do. And it seems like it's becoming slightly more common recently, so I had to come up with this. And that's what we're going to do from here on out, at least until I realize that I'm just losing all the games or something. But again, it won't be losing because of the opening. It'll be losing because of tactics later, which is 99% of the time the case in my games. So good luck with whatever you're learning. If you are looking at the Grand Prix or already playing it, hopefully this helped just a little bit. And if I missed something or misstated something, please feel free to correct me in the comments. As always, thank you for spending your time here, and I'll see you next time.